The day I died, the man I loved finally looked at me. Unfortunately, I was already dying in his arms. Blood stained my lips. His hands shook as he pressed them against the wound. For the first time in years, he looked terrified. For the first time in years, I was the only thing he could see. "Call the imperial physician!" His voice cracked. People ran. Servants panicked. But I already knew it was too late. The poison had been meant for him. I had simply arrived first. I smiled despite the blood. "Your Highness." His eyes turned red. "Don't speak." I looked at the man I had loved for most of my life, the man who never chose me, the man I had spent years protecting, the man who would never know how much I had sacrificed for him. Then I whispered, "This is the last time I save you." And the world went dark. 3 days later, he discovered the truth, the hidden letters, the lies, the betrayals, the love he never saw. Unfortunately for him, when I opened my eyes again, I was no longer willing to die for him. A person disappears the way warmth leaves a room in winter, gradually, quietly, until one day you reach for what was there and find only cold air. I was 11 years old when I first met Crown Prince Wei Liangchen. He was 12, and he was furious about it. Furious about the studying, the calligraphy drills, the ritual memorization that imperial education demanded. Furious that his free afternoons had been replaced with scrolls and tutors, and now this, a study companion foisted upon him by court recommendation. "I don't need a babysitter," he announced when they brought me into the study room. He didn't look up from the map he was annotating. I stood very still and looked at him. The afternoon light fell across his ink-stained hands. He bit the inside of his cheek when he concentrated, a habit I would spend years cataloging without ever meaning to. "I wasn't told I was here to babysit," I said. He looked up. I held his gaze. "I was told I was here to study, which I intend to do. You may do as you like." He stared at me for a long moment. Then, for the first time, he smiled. Not the practiced, diplomatic smile I would come to know. Something younger, something real. "What's your name?" "Shen Yujun." Shen Yujun. He tested it like a thing he might keep. "Sit down then. The eastern boundary markings on this map are wrong, and I can't figure out why." I sat down. I found the error in the eastern boundary markings within a quarter hour. He looked at me with something new in his eyes. That was how it began. We grew up beside each other the way ivy grows beside stone, separately, but so intertwined that by the time anyone noticed, removal would require tearing something vital. He was brilliant in the way lightning is brilliant, sudden, illuminating, occasionally destructive. He saw problems quickly, but grew impatient before solutions formed. I was the opposite, slow to ignite, meticulous in my thinking, comfortable in the long patience of a thing done correctly. We were different in every way that should have made us incompatible. Instead, we fit. I knew the exact moment I fell in love with him, though I did not understand it for what it was until much later. We were 15. A winter snowfall had trapped us in the Eastern Library for an afternoon, and he had been annoyed about it, until he wasn't. Until we were sitting too close to the brazier, speaking too honestly, laughing about something that would have seemed small to anyone listening, but felt enormous in the telling of it. He fell asleep first, leaning against the bookshelf with a scroll half unrolled across his lap. The snow outside turned the light silver. I watched him sleep and felt something shift inside me, like tumblers in a lock. Not opening, but setting, becoming fixed. "Oh," I thought, "that's what this is." I did not say it. I would never say it, not because I doubted my own heart, but because I understood the architecture of his world. Princes did not belong to study companions, and I, pragmatic, careful, already learning to love without expecting return, told myself that what I felt was enough simply to feel. For years, it was. His name was Bai Suchen, and he arrived at court when we were 22 like a plum blossom in the wrong season, unexpected, exquisite, deeply out of place. He was the fourth son of a minor noble family, elevated beyond his station by a recommendation so vague that no one could trace its origin. He had wide, liquid eyes and a way of tilting his head when he listened that made men feel they were the most interesting thing in the room. He laughed softly at the prince's observations and gasped at precisely the right moments during the prince's stories, and looked at Wei Liang-chen as though he were the sun itself. I noticed immediately that something was wrong. Not with Bai Suchen's beauty, that was real enough. Not with his manner, which was flawlessly gentle. What I noticed was something more technical. The recommendation he had come with referenced the Minister of Rights as its author, but the Minister of Rights had been in his ancestral home for 3 months, observing a mourning period. He had not been at court to write anything. I brought this discrepancy to the prince. Wei Liang-chen waved it off. Recommendations are sometimes drafted by secretaries. Yujin, you're seeing shadows. Your Highness, he's harmless. You worry too much. He was smiling when he said it. The new smile, the one Bai Suchen had been drawing out of him lately. Wider and more careless than the one I knew, less careful with where it landed. I bowed and left the room. That night, I wrote him a letter. Your Highness, I do not raise this matter to cause trouble for anyone. I raise it because I have spent 10 years watching over you, and I know how to recognize a door left deliberately unguarded. Please, be careful. Shen Yujin. I sent it through the usual channel. He never replied. I assumed he'd been busy. It began so gradually that I might have missed it if I hadn't been paying attention. But paying attention to Wei Liang-chen was something I had been doing for over a decade, and old habits are not so easily unlearned. The first thing I noticed was the credit. For years, when I prepared documents or resolved a court issue quietly, the prince would mention it. Yu Jian handled the northern grain reports, by the way, and found a discrepancy that saved us a significant budget shortfall. Small acknowledgments. He had never been effusive, but he was accurate. He remembered what I did. Then he stopped remembering. No, it was more precise than that. He started misremembering. It happened first with the dispute over the river irrigation rights. 3 provinces had been deadlocked for months, and I spent 11 days mediating in private, drafting compromise language that all 3 ministers could present to their respective lords as a victory. The prince signed off on it, pleased. 3 days later, at a dinner with court officials, someone praised the resolution. Su Qian was tremendously helpful in talking me through the competing concerns, Wei Liang-chen said warmly. His way of seeing people's perspectives is really quite... I looked at my cup of tea. I kept looking at it until the moment passed. Bai Suqian, sitting at the prince's right hand, smiled his soft smile and deflected the praise with practiced modesty. He had not been present for a single day of those negotiations. He didn't know the names of the 3 provinces involved. I told myself it was an honest mistake. The prince had spoken with Bai Suqian about the dispute early on, perhaps. Perhaps the conversation had lodged in his memory, and the months of my work had not. It was an honest mistake. Of course it was. Then it happened again. And again. And the 3rd time, I understood that it was not about mistakes at all. There was an injury, a stupid one. I had been working late and took a wrong step on a dark staircase and twisted my ankle badly enough that I could not walk normally for 2 weeks. The physician who examined me said it would have been a fracture if I were 10 years older. I sent word to the prince's office explaining that I would be working from my quarters temporarily. He never responded. A week later, I attended a small court gathering on a borrowed crutch because 2 ministers needed a signature from a document I was carrying, and neither could wait. The prince saw me across the room. Yu Jian, he said, with the easy warmth of someone who had simply not thought to ask. I haven't seen you in morning briefings. What happened to your leg? I looked at him for a moment. I sent word, Your Highness. Did you? He frowned lightly. I don't recall seeing it. Are you all right? Well enough, I said. He nodded and turned back to his conversation. I went home and did not write a letter that night. The words would not come. I sat at my desk and held the brush and thought about the staircase and the dark and the way the pain had spiked through me when I landed, and how for a brief, ridiculous moment my first thought had been, the quarterly reports are due Friday. I put the brush down. I went to sleep. When I woke, I told myself it was fine. In my first life, I wrote letters the way other men breathed, habitually, not always consciously, because the alternative was suffocation. I wrote about everything, about the court session where the old Minister of Revenue fell asleep during a reading and no one knew whether to wake him, about the first autumn frost and how it turned the palace's ginkgo trees into falling gold, about the northern reports that worried me, about a policy I thought needed revising, about a rumor I'd heard and didn't know what to make of. I wrote about him. You looked exhausted today. Please sleep before the morning session. The documents will wait. I heard you skipped the afternoon meal again. I have told the kitchen to send dumplings to your study at the 3rd hour. Please eat them and do not give them to the dogs. I noticed you've been favoring your right hand. Did you injure your wrist? I'll send for the physician if you won't. You laughed today at something in the southern courtyard, and I heard it from across the corridor, and I thought, I wrote nothing useful after that. Forgive me. Get some rest. I wrote hundreds of them. None of them arrived. I did not know this. I would not know it until I was dying, and even then I did not know why. The channel I used to send letters to the prince passed through the inner office, a small bureau of secretaries who sorted correspondence and ensured delivery to the appropriate parties. One of those secretaries was loyal to Bai Su-chen. Every letter I sent was intercepted, filed, stored in a locked chest that Bai Su-chen kept under his bed like a treasury of stolen time. Hundreds of letters, years of them, careful and worried, and sometimes aching with things I had not meant to say but said anyway because late at night writing felt like speaking to him honestly in a way that daylight never allowed. He never read a single one. And I spent years wondering why he never replied, and told myself it was because he was busy. Told myself it was because the prince was not a man who wrote letters. Told myself it was not personal, it was just the nature of things, of men, of the particular shape of our particular relationship. I kept writing anyway. Loving him in silence was the habit of my life. I had practiced it for so long it had become invisible even to me. The grain audit that saved the eastern provinces from a famine that autumn, I found the discrepancy and quietly rerouted the requisitions before anyone above me saw the gap. No one knew it had been close. 3 ministers received commendations for a smooth harvest season. The Yan Alliance, which should have collapsed when the lead negotiator fell ill 3 days before the final meeting. I sat in his seat, translated his notes into coherent positions, and improvised for 8 hours across 2 sessions. The alliance held. The lead negotiator recovered and presented the signed agreement to court. He thanked me privately. The official record mentioned his name. The minister who was being blackmailed by a third party over a private matter. I discovered it, resolved it, and ensured the blackmailer left the capital quietly. The minister never knew I had been involved. He believed he had handled it himself. 100 things like this, small and large, visible only in their absence if they had gone wrong. The prince walked through a kingdom I was quietly maintaining and saw smooth roads because he had never seen the labor of road building. I told myself this was fine. I told myself I did not need acknowledgement. I told myself that loving someone meant wanting their ease, not credit for providing it. I believed this completely. I was wrong, but I would not understand that until I was already dead. The evidence took me 3 months to gather. Bai Su-chen was careful. He was very, very careful. The connection between him and the enemies of the Wei family was buried under 4 layers of intermediary, and each layer was plausibly deniable. I had to find the shape of it sideways, not through direct evidence at first, but through pattern. Through knowing what court looked like when it ran correctly and seeing, very slowly, the shape of what was being steered wrong. I went to Weiliang on a cold morning in early winter. I had spent the previous night preparing my presentation. I knew how he thought. I knew how to organize information for him, what to lead with, what to hold back, when to let him reach a conclusion himself versus when to state it plainly. I had been reading him for over a decade. I knew his mind almost as well as my own. I had also, privately, been awake since the second hour, afraid, not of what I would say, but of what it would mean. If I was right, and I was right, I was certain I was right, it would mean the man the prince had given his trust to for the past 2 years had been engineering his destruction from the beginning. It would mean I had been right to worry, that all my gentle, careful, repeatedly dismissed concerns had been warranted. It would mean 2 years of the prince choosing Bai Suchen's explanations over mine had been 2 years of choosing wrong. I laid out my evidence. Weiliang listened with his face still and his eyes moving carefully over the documents I had set before him. I watched him and felt something in my chest that was almost hope. Then he set the documents down. "You've spent 3 months on this," he said quietly. "Yes, 3 months investigating Suchen. Investigating the security concern, Your Highness. Suchen's involvement became—" "Why?" He looked at me. "Why must you always target him, Yu Chen? What is it about him that makes you so determined to find fault?" The hope extinguished cleanly, like a candle between 2 fingers. "I'm not targeting him," I said. "I'm showing you documented evidence of—" "You've been showing me something since the day he arrived." His voice was not cruel. It was something worse than cruel. It was tired. The voice of a man explaining something obvious to someone who should already understand. "Your Highness," I said, very carefully, "I am asking you to look at the documents. I have looked at them. Then I'm asking you to consider what they mean." "What they mean," he said, "is that you have spent 3 months compiling every coincidence and correlation you could find to build a case against a man I trust. That is what they mean to me." He slid the documents back across the desk toward me. I picked them up. My hands were steady. I had spent years being steady. "I understand," I said. I bowed and left. I walked to my own quarters, set the documents on my desk, sat down in my chair and stared at the wall for a long time. I thought, I will find another way to prove it. I will find something so clear that he cannot dismiss it. I did not think he will not believe me regardless of what I find. I should have thought that. It would have been the truer thought. But I was still, even then, trying to save him. The poisoned wine was elegant, I'll give Bai Suchen that. His methods had grown more elegant as his desperation increased. And this was a beautiful plan. A single cup, designated for the prince by the seating arrangement, administered at the year-end court banquet when the hall would be crowded and chaotic, and no one would notice until it was too late. I found out 3 hours before the banquet. I told the prince's head guard. The guard told the prince. The prince spoke to Bai Suchen, who wept beautifully and said I had been harassing him for 2 years, and clearly this was another attempt to destroy his reputation. And wasn't it suspicious that I had this information at all? How would I know about the wine unless I had arranged it myself? The prince had me escorted to a waiting room and told to remain there. I sat in the waiting room for exactly 1 hour. Then I thought about the documents I had compiled and the evidence I had gathered and the decade of warnings that landed like petals on stone. And I thought about the fact that it was happening tonight. And I thought about Wei Liangshan at 12 years old with ink on his hands, telling me I didn't need to be there. And I did the only thing I had ever known how to do. I got up and went to the banquet hall. Bai Suchen saw me enter. For a single moment, the soft smile flickered. Then it returned, flawless as silk. The wine arrived. The cup was placed before the prince. "Your Highness," I said, loudly across the hall. Everyone looked. Wei Liangchen's face went cold.
You were told to. I walked to the table. I picked up the cup. The prince stood up. Eugen, I found you once at 12 years old, I said, and my voice was very calm. With a map you couldn't make sense of. You let me stay then. You should have kept letting me stay. I drank. The cup fell. The poison worked quickly. Bai Su Chen had been thorough. I heard someone scream. I heard Wei Liang Chen's voice break open in a way I had never heard it break before, calling for physicians, calling for help, calling my name with a desperation he had never directed at me in any of the 10 years prior. He caught me before I fell. He pressed his hands against me, though there was nothing to press against. No wound, just poison working its way through blood and breath. He was shaking. His hands were shaking. I looked at his face, and it was rearranged into something I didn't recognize. Not the carefully managed prince's expression, not the warm, private face he showed to Bai Su Chen. Something raw and terrible and too late. "Don't you dare," he said, barely audible. "Eugen, don't you dare." I looked at him for the last time in that life. "Your Highness," I said, "this is the last time I save you." He said my name, and I was gone. I was not there for what came after. The dead do not witness. But I have imagined it. I have imagined it so many times in my second life that it has become almost like memory. The dead physician confirming what everyone already knew. The hall going silent. The prince's face doing something that no one who saw it would ever describe aloud, because some expressions are not meant to be witnessed by others. Bai Su Chen was arrested that same night. The investigation took 4 days. 4 days during which, I imagine, Wei Liang Chen functioned the way a man functions in shock, performing the necessary actions without quite inhabiting them. The crimes were substantial, enough for execution, enough to make every suspicion I had raised look not like paranoia, but like prophecy. On the 5th day, someone found the chest under Bai Su Chen's bed. The letters were tied in bundles, sorted by year. Hundreds of them. The handwriting on the outside of each, for the Crown Prince, urgent personal correspondence, Shen Yujian, had been systematically crossed out, replaced with a small mark I could only imagine, the secretarial notation for intercepted and filed. I have thought about what it must have been like to open the first one. Your Highness, I do not raise this matter to cause trouble for anyone. I raise it because I have spent 10 years watching over you, and I know how to recognize a door left deliberately unguarded. Please be careful. Shen Yujian. And then the next, and then the next, and the one that said please eat the dumplings, and the one about the ginkgo trees, and the one where I stopped writing mid-sentence because I had heard him laugh from across the corridor and lost my train of thought entirely, and apologized for the incompleteness before closing. I imagine he read them all. I imagine it took days. I imagine what it would feel like to hold years of someone's love in your hands and understand that you never received a single piece of it. To understand that while you were choosing someone else's explanations over a man's reasonable concerns, that man had been writing you letters asking whether you'd slept, whether you'd eaten, whether your wrist was bothering you, whether you were all right. Whether you were all right. I imagine Wei Liang Shen holding those letters and understanding for the first time exactly how much he had carried without knowing he was being carried. I imagine him thinking of the 12-year-old me sitting down across from him and finding the error in the maps without being asked. And I imagine that his hell was not the kind that ends. I opened my eyes to a ceiling I recognized. My quarters in the prince's household, the familiar crack in the plaster above the second window. The smell of pine smoke from the corridor braziers, the sound of morning birds. I was 20 years old. I was alive. I lay very still and catalogued myself, breathing, hard steady, no pain, body intact, and young and alive. The memory of dying in Wei Liang Shen's arms was so present and complete that I reached up and pressed my fingers against my own chest to confirm there was nothing there. Nothing. Just the beat of a heart continuing because it could. I stared at the ceiling for a long time. My first thought was, I won't save him again. My second thought was, I won't love him again.
My third thought came slower, more carefully, the way practical thoughts arrive after emotional ones. I have to leave. Resigning from service to the Crown Prince was not procedurally simple. There were forms and precedents, and the expected dramatic resistance from the administrative office who could not imagine why anyone would choose to leave such a prestigious post. I found it surprisingly easy. I had spent my first life carrying responsibilities that were not officially mine, solving problems no one had assigned to me, maintaining structures whose maintenance no one recognized as work. The paperwork of leaving felt almost weightless by comparison. Wei Liangshen summoned me when the resignation was filed. I stood in the room where I had spent a decade and looked at the man I had died for, 20 years old and not yet the person who would spend years crying over intercepted letters, and felt something strange. Not hatred, not love, but a clean, clear grief. Like the last note of a song. "Yuzhan." He looked genuinely confused. "What is this about?" "I'm resigning, Your Highness." "I can see that. Why?" I thought about the correct answer to this question. There were many possible answers. I could explain. I could warn him about Bai Su-chen, who had been presented at court 2 weeks ago and who I had noticed Wei Liangshen noticing in the way a person notices a new light source. I could give him the documents I had already quietly begun gathering. I looked at his face. I remembered it above me, shaking. Too late. "I've decided to pursue other interests," I said. He stared at me. "That's not an answer." "It's the answer I have, Your Highness." "Yuzhan." "I've served your household since I was 11 years old," I said, and kept my voice level. "That's nearly a decade of my life. I think I'd like to see what else there is." I bowed, precisely, as I had been trained. I straightened. I looked at him one last time. "Take care of yourself," I said. It was the kind of thing I had written in letters for years and never said aloud. Saying it now felt like putting something down. I walked out. He did not follow. The tea house was not initially my idea. I had intended to find a modest position in a ministry somewhere, something with clear duties and defined hours and no one to quietly carry. But the building was available, and the location was good, and a woman named Widow Fang who sold dried goods in the neighboring stall told me with great authority that the neighborhood was lacking for a place people could sit down and be comfortable, and wasn't I the sort of person who knew how to make a space feel comfortable? I opened the tea house. It should have felt strange. My whole life had been shaped around the prince's household, its rhythms, its demands, its particular geometry. I had not known who I was without it. What I discovered? I was someone who woke early because I liked mornings, not because documents needed reviewing. I was someone who cooked badly, but cared about it. I was someone who fell into easy conversation with strangers, who remembered names and preferred stories, and found that people, given a comfortable chair and good tea, would tell you remarkable things about their lives. I was not unhappy. This surprised me the first time I noticed it. I sat in my own tea house on a cold afternoon watching the street outside and counted my inventory and realized there was no tightness in my chest, no low background awareness of responsibility waiting to be tended, no sense of holding myself ready for someone else's need. I was just sitting in a chair, drinking tea, thinking about whether I should add a winter menu. I thought about Wei Liangshen for a moment. An automatic reflex, years of habit. Then I thought about my winter menu instead. It felt like learning to breathe differently. I made friends. This was new. In my first life, I had colleagues, subordinates, the occasional useful alliance. I had the prince, who I loved without the luxury of friendship. I had not had friends, people who knew me without needing anything from me, who spent time in my company because they found it worth spending. Widow Fang became one, in her forthright and occasionally aggressive way. A young scholar named Pei Ming, who came to the tea house twice a week to avoid his landlady's questions about his rent, became another. A physician named Dr. Zhao, who sent her difficult patients to rest in my back room when they needed somewhere quiet, I learned to be known. Not as a resource, not as a solution to a problem, not as the man who handled things, just as Shen Yujin, who made acceptable tea and had strong opinions about poetry, and was inexplicably good at noticing when someone needed to sit down. My life had a texture it had never had before, not dramatic, not monumental. Good. The problems began, as I had known they would, about 4 months after I left. Not because I sabotaged anything, I want to be clear about this. I had no interest in revenge. I had no desire to watch Wei Liang Chen fail. I simply was no longer there to prevent certain failures, and certain failures are, in their nature, inevitable without someone quietly preventing them. The Yan Alliance negotiation was the first visible collapse. I heard about it through ordinary court gossip, which now reached me filtered through Widow Fang and her network of trading connections. The negotiators had reached an impasse, 2 weeks of stalled sessions. The minister in charge was increasingly desperate. In my first life, I had spent 11 days on that same impasse and found the angle that resolved it. This time, I drank my tea and thought, someone else will solve it, or they won't, and something new will emerge. I felt the ghost of the old instinct, the urgent pull toward fixing, and let it pass. The Yan Alliance did eventually resolve, 3 months later and on worse terms than it might have been, and the minister received a formal reprimand. I felt something that was not quite guilt and not quite satisfaction, but somewhere between them, an awareness that absence has weight. Wei Liang Chen, I was told by various sideways routes, was working harder than usual. Those problems that had previously resolved themselves were not currently resolving themselves. That the court was experiencing a peculiar friction that no one could quite name. I hoped, distantly, that he was eating. Then I reminded myself that was not my concern anymore. He found one by accident, apparently. This is what reached me eventually, through channels I had not expected. The story varied in its details depending on who told it, but the shape remained consistent. The Crown Prince had been reorganizing the inner office's filing system as part of a broader administrative review, and a secretary had surfaced a misfiled document, and in investigating the misfiling had found a bundle of correspondence that had never been delivered. One letter. Just one, at first, before the full investigation began. I know which letter it was. I remember writing it. Your Highness, you looked tired today. Please rest earlier. The documents will wait. S.Y. 12 words. The work of perhaps 90 seconds. The kind of thing I had written so reflexively that I could not have told you afterward that I had written it at all. He was told it was for me. He was told it had never been delivered. He requested the full archive. I was not present for what followed, but I heard about the investigation, how the lock on Baisu Chen's former quarters was broken open and the chest was found, still packed, still sorted, the notations in the secretary's handwriting still crisp and clear, how the prince had the letters counted, how the counting took all day. 412 letters across 2 years. I heard this and sat down in my own back room and was very quiet for a long time. 412. I had not counted. I had not thought to count. They were not for counting. They were for sending, for reading, for the simple human dignity of being received. Your Highness, I had written over and over in 100 different ways. He had never once heard me. He arrived on a rainy afternoon in the 3rd month of my 2nd year of freedom, tracking mud across my clean floor, apologizing immediately and sincerely, and offering to sweep it up himself if I showed him where the broom was. General Liu Qingha was 31, recently returned from a posting at the northern border, and apparently famous for 2 things: a military record that even the prince's officials spoke of with naked admiration, and a complete inability to maintain the expected distance between himself and ordinary people. He shook the hands of his own soldiers. He ate with the kitchen staff at his family estate. He wandered into small tea houses on rainy afternoons and apologized for his boots. The broom is in the back, but please don't. Sit down. I really don't mind. General Liu, I said with the particular authority I had developed from 2 years of managing a tea house, you are dripping on the corner I have already swept. Sit down and I will bring you something warm. He sat down. He looked at me with an expression of faint delight, as though being managed by a tea merchant was the most refreshing thing that had happened to him in weeks. It may have been. He came back the next day, and the day after that. Eventually, I stopped tracking his visits because they became simply part of the rhythm of the place. He listened when I spoke, not the way the prince had listened, politely, half attending, waiting for the relevant point to emerge from whatever I was saying. He listened like someone who thought what I had to say might matter. "You used to work for the Crown Prince's household," he said one afternoon. "Not accusatory, just placing information." "Yes." "But you left." "I did." He was quiet for a moment. "Was it worth it?" "Leaving, I mean." I looked at the tea house around me, the familiar smell of it, the sound of Widow Fang arguing with a supplier next door, Pei Ming in the corner writing letters to her landlady about the rent with an expression of pained creativity. "Yes," I said, "completely." Lu Qinghui smiled. It was a straightforward smile, nothing complicated in it, nothing held back. I found, to my own mild surprise, that I liked it very much. Wei Liangqin came to the tea house 3 months after the letters were found. I had been expecting him, not on that specific day, but in general. I knew the shape of his responses well enough to know that discovery would eventually translate to action, and that action for Wei Liangqin meant arriving somewhere in person rather than sending a representative. He looked different, not dramatically. His bearing was the same. His face held the same careful lines of a man accustomed to being watched. But there was something around his eyes that had not been there before. He walked in on a mid-afternoon when Lu Qinghui was sitting at his usual table, and I was standing across from the general, disagreeing with him about something, I cannot remember what, with the comfortable ease of people who have had many disagreements and expect to have many more. The prince stopped in the doorway. I looked at him. I did not feel what I had expected to feel, not the old pain, not the old pull, something more like the awareness of a thing that had ended. "Your Highness," I said. He looked at Lu Qinghui. Something moved across his face. "General Lu?" he said, a little too evenly. Lu Qinghui stood and bowed, perfectly correct, and then sat back down because I had not invited him to leave. He looked at me. I could read his expression clearly enough. "Do you need me to go?" I shook my head slightly. "Sit down, Your Highness," I said to Wei Liangqin. "I'll make tea." He sat down. He looked like a man who had prepared a speech and arrived to find the room rearranged. We did not speak honestly that first day. We were not ready for it, either of us. He drank tea and I sat across from him, and we said careful, civilized things about the court and the season, and nothing that mattered. But he came back. He came back on a cold Tuesday when the tea house was quiet, and he sat down and put his hands on the table and he said, "I read the letters." "I assumed you had." "All of them." "I know." He looked at his hands. "Why didn't you tell me that you were sending them, that you felt?" "I did tell you," I said. "You never received it." He flinched. "I'm not saying that to wound you," I said, honestly. "I'm saying it because it's true. I expressed what I felt through the letters. You didn't read them. I don't know what more I could have done." "You could have said it to my face." "Could I?" I met his eyes. "Your Highness, think carefully. If I had looked at you across your study desk and told you what I felt, would you have heard me? Or would you have found a reason to set it aside, the way you set aside the documents I brought you about Bai Su Qian, the way you set aside every concern I ever raised that inconvenienced you?" Silence. "I think," I said more gently, "that you were not in a place to hear me. And I think I spent years trying to speak in ways you could receive rather than ways that were honest. That was my mistake, not the letters themselves." He looked at me for a long time. His eyes were red at the edges, the same red they had been in the banquet hall over my dying body. "I know," he said. "I know it was." He did not come back with an apology, exactly, Or rather, he came back with apologies, but they were not the kind that expected forgiveness. They were the kind that simply needed to be said. He came back on a Thursday and told me that the Minister of Revenue had been dealing with a serious audit problem, and he sat down with the records himself and found it was nearly identical to a discrepancy I had caught, apparently, 3 years earlier. "I found it in the old files," he said. "Your notation, the solution you applied." And? It worked. I poured him more tea. He looked at the cup. "How many things did you fix," he said quietly, "that I attributed to the natural order of the kingdom running smoothly?"
"A number of things, Your Highness, and you never know. Why not tell me? Why not demand credit or recognition or—" "Because I didn't want credit," I said. "I wanted things to go well for you, and they did." I paused. "The mistake I made was believing that wanting good things for someone was enough, that I could keep pouring myself into someone else's life and it wouldn't cost me anything, that self-erasure was the same as love." He was silent for a long time. "Is that what it was?" he said finally. "Self-erasure? That's what it became," I said. "Bei Su-chen made a final attempt in my second life. I knew he would. He was not a man who accepted defeat while he had any pieces left to play. He came to me directly this time. That was new. In my first life, he had operated through proxies and whispers and the prince's own blind trust. Now he arrived at my tea house on a quiet morning when no one else was present, sat down across from me and smiled his soft, careful smile. "You're more difficult to manage than I expected," he said. "I've had practice," I said. "You could make this much easier for yourself. Leave the prince alone. Stop whatever you're doing to rebuild his—" "I'm not doing anything," I said. "I'm running a tea house." He looked around at my very ordinary tea house. "And the general. General Lu Qing drinks tea here. That is the nature of tea houses." Bei Su-chen's smile did not change, but something behind it did. "You've made powerful friends." "I have good ones," I corrected. "That's different. I had, in my second life, assembled the evidence against him within 8 months rather than 3. I knew what I was looking for this time, and I was not carrying the weight of a dozen other responsibilities that blunted my focus. I had given the documents to Lu Qing, who had given them to the appropriate military authority, who had begun the investigation that was, even as Bei Su-chen sat in my tea house, quietly dismantling everything he had built. "Your people should have received a warrant this morning," I said conversationally. "I imagine things are quite busy at your household right now." Bei Su-chen went very still. "You should leave," I said, not unkindly. "Not just this tea house, the capital, now before the warrant becomes an arrest." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he left. The exposure was clean, public, documented. The connections to foreign adversaries, the forged documents, the intercepted correspondence, everything laid out without flourish, without drama, without requiring the prince to experience it as a crisis. By the time Wei Liang-chen was formally informed, the structure of it had already been resolved. He came to the tea house afterward. "You had all of this," he said. "I've had it for some time. You didn't tell me. You could have used it to—" "To what?" I said. "Manipulate you? Force you to see me?" I shook my head. "Your Highness, I didn't want you to see me because you had no choice. That was never the point." He sat down and put his face in his hands briefly, then composed himself. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I know that too." He looked at me. Something in his face was different from the man I had died for, or perhaps the same man finally uncovered. Tired, honest, no longer trying to make the room rearrange itself around what he needed. "What do you need?" he asked me. The question surprised me. He had not asked me that before. In 10 years, he had not once asked. I thought about it seriously. "Time," I said finally. "And for you to stop expecting anything. Come and drink tea if you want, or don't, but don't come because you need something from me." He nodded. He came back, without needing something. Just to sit and drink tea and sometimes say things and sometimes not. It was, slowly, surprisingly, enough to build something from. It was Lu Qing who helped me see it.
We were walking along the river on an autumn evening, and I was explaining with some enthusiasm how I had restructured the supply order for the tea house to reduce waste in the winter months, and he was listening with the expression of a man who finds practical problem-solving genuinely interesting, and I stopped mid-sentence because I had realized what I was doing.
I was happy. Unremarkably, ordinarily, completely happy. In the way that has nothing to do with circumstances being perfect and everything to do with not being in pain. "You've gone quiet," Liu Qinghe observed. I was thinking. "About supply chains?" "About love," I said. He waited. "In my first life," I stopped. He did not know about my first life, of course. No one did. I rephrased. "For a long time, I believed that loving someone meant making yourself as useful as possible to them, that love was demonstrated through sacrifice, through solving their problems and protecting their interests and carrying what they couldn't carry." I looked at the river. I thought that was devotion, but I think what it actually was trying to earn a place. Liu Qinghe was quiet for a moment. "And if you couldn't earn it, you believed you didn't deserve one." "Something like that." "That's not love," he said. Not harshly, just plainly, the way he said most things. "Or rather, it is love, but it's love that doesn't trust itself to be received without conditions, love that apologizes for existing." I thought about 412 letters, about a person writing, "Please rest," and "Please eat," and "I heard you laugh today," and sending them into the dark. "Yes," I said. "That's exactly what it was." "You don't do that anymore," he said. I looked at him. "No, I'm learning not to." He smiled, the plain, uncomplicated smile. "Good." I understood then what the difference was. The difference between the man who had spent years loving quietly and invisibly because he did not believe his love had the right to take up space, and who I was becoming, someone who could say I am here without hedging it, someone who did not require suffering to prove the depth of what he felt. Loving people had not been my mistake. Losing myself had. And now I was finding my way back. Time passes differently when you're no longer counting it in other people's needs. Weiliang Chen and I rebuilt something slowly, carefully, the way bone rebuilds after a break, imperfectly and stronger for it. He was not the same man who would let me carry his kingdom while thanking someone else. He was trying. And I had learned that trying, sustained and genuine and without expectation of reward, is not the same as the trying that expects forgiveness. He sat with the ministers in sessions that I was not part of, and came to the tea house afterward and said, "This is what happened, and what do you think?" and listened when I answered, actually listened, argued back when he disagreed, changed his mind once in a while. He brought things to me, not to have me carry them, just to think alongside me. It was what we had been once at 12 and 11, two boys at a study table arguing about boundary markings on an incorrect map. It was what we could have been all along if he had seen me, if I had let myself be seen. I thought sometimes about the version of him who had found the letters too late, who had broken over a chest full of intercepted time. I did not pity him, but I understood him. I understood what it was to move through the world, not knowing what you were missing until you were left holding it in your hands. Liu Qinghe remained. That was the right word for it, remained. He was not a man who made declarations or demanded decisions. He was a man who showed up on Tuesday afternoons and did not ask anything from the showing up. I thought about what he had said by the river. I thought about it for a long time. Then one afternoon, I looked at him across the table and said, "I think I'd like more tea." He looked up from his cup. His expression did not leap to triumph or relief. It simply settled, quietly, into something that had apparently been waiting there with great patience for quite some time. "More tea is also available," he said, "if you change your mind." "I won't," I said. I didn't. It was spring. The tea house was doing well enough that I had hired 2 assistants and could close on festival days without catastrophe, which felt like a different kind of victory than any I had known before. Wei Chen came on a Thursday afternoon. He came alone, which he did now because he had learned that arriving with the retinue of the Crown Prince made my regular customers deeply uncomfortable and made me considerably annoyed. He sat down. I made tea. We were quiet together, which we had learned to be. The silence between us had changed character over the years. It had lost the quality of things unsaid and become instead the quality of things understood. "You look well," he said. "I am well." He looked at the window. I found another letter in the old files, one I hadn't seen before. I waited. "It was about the ginkgo trees," he said. "You wrote about the light, autumn light on the trees in the eastern courtyard." "I remember." He was quiet for a moment. "I used to walk through that courtyard every day. I never noticed the trees." "I know." He noticed them now. He turned from the window. His eyes were, as they always were now in our conversations, very honest. He had given up the careful princely composure when he sat in my tea house. I had not asked him to. He had simply gradually stopped needing it here. "I spent a long time looking at things and not seeing them. I spent a long time having what I needed and not knowing it." "Yes," I said. "I don't want to make that mistake again." He looked at me. "With anything." I understood what he meant. I had understood for some time what he meant. I thought about the man I had died for, who had finally seen me as I was leaving. I thought about the letters he had read too late and the grief he had carried, and the years of change that had not been demanded but had happened anyway. I thought about whether redemption is something that arrives or something that is built, stone by stone, through choices that no one requires you to make. He had made them, quietly, without expectation. I thought about Liu Qinghe, whose Tuesday afternoons had become something different and better than tea, and who understood when I told him about this particular Thursday afternoon that some things needed to be said and some doors needed to be closed properly before anything new could be walked through fully. I thought about the boy who had spent his life writing letters into the dark and asking for nothing. I picked up my tea. "Your Highness," I said, "I spent half my life loving you without words, and the other half learning to love myself with them. I am not the same person who died for you, and you are not the same person who let me." He did not look away. "I know," he said. "Then what you're asking for," I said, "is not the man I was, it's who I am now." "Yes," he said, "that's exactly who I'm asking for." I was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the spring light moved across the street. Somewhere in the next room, Widow Feng was arguing cheerfully with a supplier about the price of dried persimmons. I had a good life. I had built it myself out of mornings and tea and ordinary kindness and the slow, astonishing discovery that I was worth more than I had given myself credit for. I was not willing to lose it. I was not willing to carry anyone anymore without being known. We begin as equals, or we don't begin. Wei Chen reached across the table and took my hand, not urgently, not desperately, the way a man takes something he does not intend to lose and intends now to be worthy of holding. "Then spend the rest of your life," he said quietly, "letting me prove it." I looked at him. The man who had never seen me, the man who had spent years learning to look. The spring light was very warm. "All right," I said. And this time, for the first time, I believed him.
The end.